On this Aircheck episode, we catch up with two radio vets, Mike Boyle and Paul Heine, two industry pros that decided to hang up their headphones earlier than most and entered into the world of print, the trade journalism side of the radio business, a community-building apparatus of a different sort.
That's a side of the business that has its own set of stories, and we'll hear some of them from both their perspectives. Plus, Mike's experience in Berlin when the wall came down, the moment watching REM from the front row, a Donny Osmond visit that caused pandemonium, and Paul's encounter with George Harrison, his interview with Howard Stern, and two other rather unique moments, one with Frank Zappa and the other with Ozzy Osbourne.
Let's begin.
Welcome to Aircheck Season 5, a podcast about radio's personality from radio personalities. Listen as radio and TV's best on-air personalities, managers, owners, and consultants tell the tales of their storied careers with your hosts from Philadelphia, Rich DeSisto and Steve Raymond.
I'm Rich DeSisto.
And I'm Steve Raymond.
When you speak to today's radio veterans about their love for the business, the common thread of its origins lies within those legendary personalities on those legendary radio stations. It was the mid-1970s, and for a 14-year-old Mike Boyle, it was those airwaves coming from Pittsburgh, 13Q.
13Q! Oh, baby, 13Q in your ear. You got it. 55 and a half minutes of music this hour on WJAS AM and FM in Pittsburgh. Jackson Armstrong, I'm your lead.
For Paul Heine, it was Buffalo's WKBW.
From now till midnight Monday, the sounds of the music that will make radio even more entertaining for you on KB15.
Before he landed on WCMF in Rochester.
Hello, everybody. This is Rick Nielsen from Cheap Trick. You know, whenever we get into Rochester, we go completely nuts with CMF 96 FM. Oh, yeah.
Please welcome to Aircheck, Mike Boyle and Paul Heine.
Hey, man, it's great to be here. Really appreciate you guys having us on the Aircheck podcast. Truly honored to be here.
Yeah, ditto from me. Couldn't think of three other fellas that I like more in the industry to do this with, so this will be a lot of fun.
Well, Mike and Paul, this is a first on Aircheck, not only as co-guests, but stories told directly from the side of the business. Not too many people hear about much anymore, the radio trades. And you two were in the thick of it during a pinnacle time.
And on that note, Mike, you have to explain what the hell happened with Donny Osmond.
He was just one of hundreds and hundreds of artists who stopped by FMQB Friday Morning Quarterback, which was located in beautiful downtown Cherry Hill, New Jersey. He was, brought in by the record company, and, as they would, walk the artist around the building. There's two magazines. There was the Top 40 magazine, and there was the album magazine, the tip sheet. And, everybody would just get a chance to meet him. So it was neat. Wasn't, my cup of tea musically, but he was a real nice guy.
Super nice guy. Yeah. And it was amazing because we had so many artists stop by, like Mike mentioned, Brian May from Queen. And I remember Roger McGuinn from the Byrds sitting on my desk, playing this new song that he'd just written with Tom Petty. Elvis Costello came in one week. A few weeks later, Nick Lowe came in. But Donny Osmond really disrupted the place more than any other artist, because there were a lot of women working at FMQB in terms of taking reports and taking comments from program directors and music directors. And when they got wind that Donny was coming in, work just stopped. Phones didn't get answered. Reports were not taken. He just breezed through the place and was so nice to everyone, signed autograph, took pictures. The ladies loved him. And, Mike and I were just sitting there going, huh?
So Friday Morning Quarterback, or FMQB, for both of you guys, that was your first stop into print from on air. And we're going to get into your radio broadcast tenure, of course, but talk about the crossroads. Leading up to that decision, you were both, you were both building a nice resume of call letters, some legendary stations. Mike, let's start with your story.
What got me to FMQB was I, at the time, was the operations manager at WDHA 105.5, the Jersey Giant.
New Jersey's premier rock station, WDHA FM, Dover, North Jersey.
That was in like 1984 to 88 that I was there. Just around the middle part of 1988, the Arbitron book had come out, and we finally beat WNEW-FM in our own backyard for the very first time in that radio station's history.
Woohoo! Nice.
And it was a momentous occasion for that staff, who I was just immensely proud of. Just wonderful people, wonderful owners. It was just a really, really great situation. And time went on after that, 1988, kind of continued on. And the folks at FMQB, who I'd been working with, anyway, just in terms of, every week, we would talk about, the music that we were considering on the radio station, making our weekly report of our playlist. And, we got to talking, and, they offered me an opportunity to come and do something different, to talk to people, programmers about music, and work with the record companies to, write about the new music, and just a whole bunch of different opportunities. And I just, I kind of thought about it. I looked around and I went, you know what? I don't want to be the guy in the WKRP song, going from city to city, and just didn't want that in my life. And I didn't want that for my family. But I knew that's kind of what I would have had to have done next, was to go to the next city, if you will. But I had an opportunity to join FMQB and stay in New Jersey, and that's what I did.
Now, Paul, you had already been at the quarterback a few years earlier before Mike arrived, and you too had a list of call letters to add to your resume prior. What was the mindset for you to take that leap into print?
Yeah. I got to FMQB, like you said, a couple of years before Mike. It was the first time our career paths crossed, although not the last time. And for me, I was at 97 Rock, WGRQ in Buffalo, big rock station. WGRQ, 97 Rock. But not impervious to the ups and downs of radio. And there was format change in January of 1985 from AOR to AC.
A local radio station has been rocked by its new musical policy. Carl Brown has that story.
The shocking news came without warning today at 10 a.m. Taft Broadcasting, which owns WGRQ-FM, said it's dropping the station's popular album rock format. It was number one among 18 to 34-year-olds. But this morning, 8 staff announcers were told the music was dead and to start packing. Larry Norton was half of the morning show, known as Q Morning Zoo.
And I just feel very surprised, very shocked, and I'm probably kind of stunned.
So while the change was sudden, it is permanent. In Buffalo, Carl Brown, Channel 7 Eyewitness News.
The owner, Taft Broadcasting, was preparing to sell the station, and they wanted to lower the overhead. So they shit-canned all of us. And 2 days before I got that news, my wife gave me some even bigger news, that she was pregnant with our first child.
Wow.
So I needed a job like yesterday. And I interviewed for a lot of radio jobs in the region. Nothing really felt right to me. So I was friendly with the people at FMQB, with Bill Hard and some of the other folks that were there at the time. In March of 85, I moved from Buffalo to Cherry Hill and started working at FMQB. Cal and Lucille Rudman had founded the publication on a card table in their house in Camden, where Cal had been a top 40 disc jockey known as the Round Mound of Sound.
I became a disc jockey in Philadelphia and extremely successful at it, and adopted a musical personality of Cal Big Beat Rudman, the Round Mound of Sound, the Big Baileys, who says it tastes from outer space. And they would bring me the records, they being the music promotion people, and they'd bring a stack of records. I didn't know how that all worked, and I'd listen to a few bars of each particular record. The ones I liked, I'd put on the air. If the record was good, I would play it 6, 7 times in a row. So nice, I got to do it twice. I got to do it because I'm used to it. So neat, I got to repeat. That's how it all started.
At first I thought, well, this is like going to really set me up for the next radio job, because I'm going to find out about all the gigs before anybody else and, get the jump on applying for them. But I ended up liking the work and the people and the platform of FMQB so much that I stuck around for 19 years and then moved on to other publications that covered the radio biz.
Okay, so at this point, you guys are working together at FMQB, the start of each of your 35-plus year journeys. A journey in various roles and publications chronicling and influencing the evolution of the radio and music industries. Talk about the relationship that has obviously turned into a lifelong friendship. Paul, knowing Mike was coming from the radio side as well, what were your thoughts about his arrival?
Yeah, I'd actually met Mike very briefly before he joined FMQB at a Sinead O'Connor concert in New York. I remember him pulling me aside and saying, someday I want to work at FMQB. I think what you guys do is really cool. And I thought he was just, blowing smoke up my ass. Little did I know it was maybe less than a year later, and you had joined. We developed a friendship because, we were both sort of at the same point in our lives where we'd done radio. We now had families. In fact, my youngest son and Mike's only son were born how many weeks apart?
2 weeks max.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we would get together with the wives, and, they were both nurses, and we were both working in the radio and music businesses. And, we just had so much in common. We lived near each other. We'd get together a lot and hang out. We were both huge Howard Stern fans. And so we just developed this friendship and this sort of mutual admiration. There were things that Mike did way better than I did. And there were some things that, maybe I was a little better at.
A little better at, guys. let me tell you something. I developed into what I believe is a good writer, and the only reason that I was able to develop that skill was because I learned it from a very patient Paul Heine. Not only at FMQB, because I had the opportunity. Paul's main focus was the news, at FMQB. I mean, Paul did a lot of other things as well, but his main focus was his Dr. Dirt hat. Paul would from time to time assign me small little news things that we would include in FMQB in the news and the dirt section. And, I would graduate into doing long form interviews with programmers or with a music artist or whatever. After FMQB, I got a chance to work with Paul. He was instrumental in getting me a job at Billboard Radio Monitor. And I really learned about writing at Billboard Radio Monitor, which eventually became R&R. And I got to write, for Billboard. And Paul was the head of editorial, for that rock section of Billboard Radio Monitor, and he was the editor of R&R. So anything that I did, eventually at some point, while it did go through other editors, it went through Paul. And there were times when Paul, had to pull me aside and go, hey, try this, or this. He helped me, introduced me to some other writers at Billboard who helped me as well. But I wouldn't have become the writer that I believe that I am today if it wasn't for my good friend. The really cool thing about FMQB, there was a really great camaraderie. I'd mentioned names, earlier, the people that had gone through that building. Even another, great writer in his own right, Tom Taylor, worked at Inside Radio and had his own newsletter, after that. I mean, just, and we all, I believe, learned many different things from each other. But for me personally, Paul Heine is really responsible for, me being able to then, move on, from radio and from the trade magazine business into marketing roles that I've held since I've been out of the business since 2009. And I wouldn't be as adept at those things if it hadn't been for Paul taking me under his wing.
Oh, you're too kind, and the check is in the mail. But there were a lot of, as Mike said, some terrific writers at FMQB. Mike mentioned Tom Taylor, who, pretty much wrote the book on daily newsletters for the radio business at Inside Radio, along with Jerry Del Cagliano and the guy that went on to KYW. I can't remember his name. Steve Butler, yes. But also we had Barry Jekyll, who went on to work at Billboard and MTV and all sorts
Mark Schiffman.
Great writer. Yeah. Pat Berkery, who would freelance for the Philadelphia Inquirer and is one of the best rock drummers in Philly. The number of people that came and went through FMQB was just insane. And I think we've only scratched the surface of the talented people that worked there during the time we were there. So like Mike was saying, there was just a lot of cross-pollination happening. And for both Mike and I think we really developed our chops as writers and editors when we went to New York and we worked for the former Airplay Monitor, which had been rebranded as Billboard Radio Monitor. And Mike, I don't know about you, but the first day that I walked in there and we've got cubicles with all the people that worked at Billboard magazine, and there's Ed Chrisman, he interviewed Led Zeppelin, and just all these writers whose bylines we had seen in Billboard magazine were now our coworkers. I would pinch myself every day when I went in there. For both Mike and I, in addition to writing stories for Monitor, which was the radio industry audience, we also were writing stories about radio for Billboard with its music industry audience.
And the occasional article also, Paul, for Hollywood Reporter, or they had a whole stable of magazines we'd write
right
for.
Exactly. They had Ad Week and Media Week and Brand Week and Editor and Publisher, which covered the newspaper business. So it was joining this group of publications that were owned by this giant conglomerate called VNU. And the joke was that the way you pronounce VNU was V on you, because it was this Dutch company that owned so many things, including Nielsen, and then they later bought Arbitron. Yeah, that was a real thrill. We joined Billboard Radio Monitor just as radio was rolling out new means of distributing content. Like HD radio was the new thing. I remember driving around in a car with the engineer from WOR, and he's showing me how it sounds in FM, or demonstrating how it sounds in FM and how it sounds in HD. And satellite radio came around about that time. I think 2001 was when XM signed on. So this was only a few years into satellite radio. iHeartRadio had recently launched as a streaming aggregator and streaming service. Apple had launched the iPod. I remember we carried a story in Billboard Radio called Radio versus the iPod. And everyone was like, is the iPod going to kill radio? What it did do is it gave birth to a new format, the Jack and Bob format, which is now known as adult hits, but those stations were just popping up all over the US and Canada. It's like your iPod on shuffle. Definitely technology was influencing programming and how content was distributed. So it was an exciting time back then. Yeah, hats off to Scott McKenzie for hiring both of us. We learned a great deal from this guy who had never worked in radio, but knew everything about publishing and about distributing content, and had worked at CNN and had worked in the newspaper business, and was an incredibly supportive person to work with.
As was our good friend Chuck Taylor, who taught us both a little thing here and there about writing as well.
You guys kind of never looked back, right? There seemed to be a common instinctual feeling between the two of you that this was the path you wanted to pursue. But what was it about the print side of radio? You both spent many years working at various trades, and Paul, 19 years at FMQB.
I think what Mike and I enjoyed the most about it was that it was at this intersection of the radio and record industries. And as Mike was saying, we got to develop relationships with all the top programmers around the country, which was incredibly thrilling. We also got to know all the heads of rock promotion at the major labels. One of my first gigs was writing this section called Dirt Alert, which was news and gossip. We hear that 92.3 FM in New York is considering a flip to classic rock. Dr. Dirt will investigate. Yeah, I took on this sort of Dr. Dirt character, but under Mike and I and a really talented group of people, we evolved what had been a tip sheet focused purely on the music to more of a programming trade publication that had interviews with programmers and air talent and radio CEOs and features on how to do your job better, columns, contributors, and it became widely read in the rock radio community, and it was just a blast to work there.
It's kind of important also, you mentioned, we worked with, great people, Cal and Lucille Rudman, who started that publication, and ran it. On the top 40 side, Ray Milanese, just, a giant in the industry. Fred Dean ran the album side, and he was the one who was responsible for hiring me. Think about some of these names of people who came through both of those, publications, names that people recognize in this industry. People like Ray Koob and Mark Laspina and Dave Heffel and Tom Cunningham and Michael Parrish and Mike Bacon and Mike Marone. I don't want to leave anybody out, but it was that big that it had people like that as a part of it.
Talk a little bit more about how the trade side of the business embraced digital. Paul, how did you guys adapt to all that?
Yeah, 1985, it was pre-internet. Each week, hundreds of stations all over the country would phone in their playlists to this bullpen of employees who took down their ads and their heavies and mediums and lights and also their comments on new music. And we published song charts and playlists and comments and song picks. Those were a big deal back then. It was really primitive at first. The publication was done on IBM Selectric typewriters. When the fax machine came along, it was revolutionary. It was like, holy God, people don't have to phone in their playlists. They can fax it over. Obviously, the publication went from being mimeographed to being printed. It became a 4-color glossy publication. There was less emphasis on putting the, top song picks on the front page and more about doing cover story interviews. It was around the age of consolidation, 1996, the passage of the Telecom Act. So, we would interview people like Randy Michaels and Scott Ginsburg and Jimmy DeCastro. We interviewed Howard Stern. We interviewed all the great rock programmers, Kevin Weatherly and Bill Weston, Dave Richards. The list goes on and on. But throughout it all, it was really sort of like a form of social media for people in rock radio. Specifically the comments section, where programmers or music directors would talk about what was working for them in their market, what the audience was reacting to, what new records they liked. And folks would want to hear, what Aaron Riley at MMR thought about a record, or Mark Chernoff at NEW, or Ron Valeri at WAAF. One of the benefits to cleaning out your attic is you find all sorts of things. Here's an issue from 1987. So I found these comments from Harvey Dr. K. Kojan, then the music director at KLOL in Houston. And he says, "You think that Joshua Tree sounds good on the radio? Well, wait till you hear these songs live. This is one show where you don't leave talking about the lights or the singer's pants." Stuff like that every week. And I honestly believe that the late 70s through the 80s and into the 90s was like the third golden age of radio. You had the original network radio of the 30s and 40s, and then you had the AM top 40 heyday in the 50s and 60s. But this period that Mike and I worked at FMQB, radio was so influential culturally, musically, in terms of opinions and personalities. We got to work at, like I said, this intersection of radio and records during one of radio's golden eras. It was a huge privilege for both of us.
In addition to that, we got to do some really cool things. We traveled the world. We literally traveled the world seeing artists. And, the record companies, would invite us, to go to do things. I think of all the cities that Paul and I visited and the artists that we saw. One in particular will always be big in my head, and that was the summer of 1990, July of 1990, when the wall was coming down in Berlin. And Roger Waters had his concert there.
Towards the end of the 80s, when Roger had separated from Pink Floyd, the idea of doing The Wall as a big show came up again, and we investigated the idea of doing it, in the Sahara Desert or in extraordinary places, Monument Valley in America, somewhere where we could make a big statement.
And then in 89, in November 89, when it all started to disintegrate, it became completely obvious that maybe Berlin was going to be a place where it would be possible.
The Wall in Berlin, it was just Roger seeing the opportunity, the obvious opportunity, to reproduce his piece in a place which would have some further meaning, perhaps.
I got to be there and
Wow.
Actually walk across Checkpoint Charlie into East Berlin, which was really kind of a weird thing, and cut down pieces of the wall. And Dave Lonco from Mercury Records put that whole thing together. And about 3 or 4, maybe 5 of us had the privilege, and I use that word all the time because that's what it was, the privilege to do that. But that's just a taste of, some of the things that Paul and I would do. I mean, Paul has, great stories as well.
We would go to all the big conventions. The Pollock convention was a big one in Los Angeles. And I remember I was out there for that. And while we were in LA, we would always make our rounds to the record companies. And I was visiting with Kenny Pavogel at Warner Brothers Records in Burbank. This was like late 87 or early 88. Kenny was on the phone half the time that I was meeting with him. His phone just kept ringing, and PDs and managers were calling him back, and he was taking these calls and trying to get his records played, etc. And I'm looking at all the pictures on the wall, and he had met everybody, because if you think about the Warner Brothers roster in that period, they had Dire Straits, REM, Prince, Talking Heads, Fleetwood Mac, Tom Petty.
Van Halen.
Yeah, Van Halen, exactly. They're all on Warner Brothers. And Kenny's got a picture of himself with all these artists, just covering the walls. And multiple pictures of him with George Harrison, including one where they're on the lawn. Do you know the cover of All Things Must Pass, the triple album? So it's taken at George's house. It was called Friar Park, and it was south of London, and he bought this huge castle. And so there's George with the 4 gnomes, those statues sitting around him. And there's a picture of Kenny with George and the gnomes. And I'm like, holy crap, you went to George's house? He goes, oh yeah, every time he puts out a record, he invites us over to listen to it at his house. And I'm like, oh my God, I want your job so bad. And I'm like, someday you got to introduce me to him. So anyhow, after our meeting, he showed me out toward the front door, and on the way he says, do you want to meet with Russ Thyrett? And I'm like, of course I want to meet with Russ Thyrett. He was the head of promotion for all formats. And Mike, you'll remember this, we would get points with Cal and Ray Milanese if we got face-to-face time with somebody like a Russ Thyrett. So I'm like, yeah, hell yeah, I want to meet Russ Thyrett. So we go in there, and he's got this huge office, and he's listening to this. I remember it so clearly. He's listening to this new album by a band from Niagara Falls, New York, called Honeymoon Suite. And I was familiar with them because we had played them on the air at 97 Rock. And Russ is listening to it, and he's going, it was their second album. They'd already had a hit with New Girl Now. Russ was sort of perplexed that he just couldn't find a single on it, and he was asking me what I thought, and I told him, yeah, I had the same reaction. And we're sitting there talking and everything, and there's a knock on the door, and Russ says, come in, and in walks George Harrison. And I nearly lost it. And he looked tremendous. He had these Dayglow sneakers on. They were not expecting him at all. They didn't even know that he was in the country. And he was in the U.S. because he'd been to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame the night before in New York, where the Beatles were inducted. And I think Dylan was inducted that year. Kenny is asking him about, what was that like? And what about Mike Love's acceptance speech? I don't know if you remember, but when the Beach Boys were inducted, Mike Love went on a tirade, and he just challenged other bands to, match the Beach Boys touring challenge or touring schedule. It's like, I'd like to see Bruce Springsteen do as many dates as we do. I'd like to see the Stones do as many dates as we do. He even called Mick Jagger and Billy Joel chicken shit for not joining them on stage. It was it made huge headlines.
The Beach Boys continue to do we did about 180 performances last year. I'd like to see the Mop Tops match that. I'd like to see Mick Jagger get out on his stage and do I Get Around versus Jumpin' Jack Flash any day now. Now, a lot of people are going to go out of this room tonight thinking that Mike Love is crazy. Well, they've been saying that for years.
And so they're asking George about it, and he says, I don't really understand why Mike would say things like that, because Mike is a meditator. So either he's meditating too much or not enough. And then George points at me with his finger and he goes, now don't you go printing that in your paper now, you hear? And I thought, wow. Oh my God, I've been scolded by the quiet Beatle.
How'd your interview with Howard Stern come about?
Well, I had the great privilege of interviewing Howard Stern in person in February of 1996 in the K-Rock New York conference room. It was incredible. And thanks to Mike Boyle for writing half the questions. he was the ultimate Howard fanboy. But it wasn't just an interview with Howard. It was with his agent, Don Buchwald, and Mel Karmazin, the founder and CEO of Infinity Broadcasting, which, as we all remember, was syndicating Stern at the time. And, you know, Howard, Don, and Mel, it almost sounds like the original Grand Funk Railroad, right? It was three of the most powerful people in radio. And it was definitely the most intimidating interview of my life, to sit down across from the three of these guys. I mean, I was scared shitless. But I found that Howard was much kinder and gentler off the air than on the air. We talked earlier about the Telecom Act being passed in February of 96. This was just a few weeks later. And Howard was on about 23 stations at that point, and they wanted to grow the list to 200. So they were really pitching the show to expand the network. And as Mel explained, you know, if you just bought a radio station and you didn't know what to do with it, you know, the ratings are in the crapper, you know, I've got a solution for you. His name is Howard Stern. It was really cool. You know, Howard already had a number one, he was already number one in a bunch of markets, including New York and Philadelphia and Los Angeles. He was a regular on Leno and Letterman. He was a best-selling author. He was about to start filming Private Parts. And so I asked him, you know, if he'd kind of had his fill of radio and if he wanted to conquer other media. And he said, let's see if I can find the right part here. So this is Howard. He says, no, I don't feel any been there, done that with radio. There's plenty more to do, and I have a lot of fire in me. Radio can be elevated so much more. It can be such an exciting medium that I've not grown tired of it in the least. It's finally starting to heat up. I see television performers crash and burn because they got to stick to the same old crap, the same old format. They can't voice an opinion. Let's break for a commercial now. But to me, radio represents the ultimate freedom. As long as I'm going to be a creative individual, radio is the best way for me to get my rocks off. I mean, we ended up republishing that interview and sending it out across the industry. There was such demand for it. I'll never forget it.
Yeah, it was a major, major coup. And kudos to Mr. Heine there, because it was pulling that off at that time there was nothing bigger going on.
So, Mike, you mentioned being in Berlin when the wall came down. What other moment or moments have stayed with you over the years?
The most memorable, I don't know if people will remember a syndicated show that was called Mountain Stage.
Live from the historic Capitol Plaza Music Hall in Charleston, West Virginia, welcome to another Mountain Stage.
But Mountain Stage was a syndicated show, and I had the opportunity to go to watch REM perform on the stage. The thing that was the most cool about it was that I got to sit in the front row during rehearsal, and I was watching Michael Stipe. I'm looking right up at him. He's sitting on a stool, and to just hear the vocals coming out, he's a small man. Very, you know, Michael Stipe is not a big man, but we all know what his voice, you know, was all about.
Joining Robin Hitchcock on this edition in their only American concert appearance of the year, REM, perhaps the world's hottest rock and roll band.
And I just sitting in awe of just looking right up at, like he's right in front of me. And I'm going, and another one of those, oh my God, privileged moments.
They came to deflect a bit of their spotlight onto a show known for spotlighting so many others who rarely get a chance to shine.
I got to see U2 perform in Italy. And the cool thing about that record company junket was that afterwards we all piled into a van and we drove for like half hour, 40 minutes into the mountains in Italy to a villa. And we spent the entire night until like 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning with the band, just having a drink, you know, doing, whatever. And then two other things that were just, again, there's that word again, privileges. Going to Stevie Nicks' house, which was actually a little castle up in the hills in Hollywood, and listening to, a new record that she had out, and the late, great Ronnie James Dio, who couldn't have been a nicer guy, invited Mark LaSpina and I to his house when he was getting ready to put out a record. It was the one-on-one of these things that I brought up that were most special, because many times we, all four of us, have been backstage and we've been in the group situation. You get the group thing, but how often do you have the opportunity, the privilege to have one-on-one real quality time with people? It's for me, those were things that just really stood out.
Yeah, Mike, what you're talking about, I mean, I've just got to jump in here and tell you one of my favorite rock star interview stories. It was at 97 Rock. It was the very early 80s, and it was with Ozzy Osbourne. God rest his soul. He was at the height of his popularity. He had put out the album The Blizzard of Oz, which had Crazy Train and Flying High Again, and he was truly flying high again. And so he came down to 97 Rock for an afternoon drive interview before the show. I was the lucky jock that got to do the interview. I asked him all the questions you would ask Ozzy then, like, about biting the head off a live bat and everything. And our air studios were on the ground floor, and they had these two big windows, and you could kind of look in from the street and see into the studio. A group of fans started to develop outside on Virginia Place in Buffalo, where 97 Rock was located at the time. And by the time the interview ended, there must have been, 50, 75 people out there. And Ozzy had walked over from his hotel on Delaware Avenue, just about 5 minutes away, and he didn't really have time to sign autographs and spend time with the fans. So he asked me if there was another exit out of the building other than the door right next to where all these fans were. And I said, yeah, we can walk through the building, through WGR-AM studios out onto Franklin Street. And in fact, I'm off the air at 7, so I can drive you back to your hotel. And he goes, great.
Wow.
So I walk him through WGR-AM. He's getting some weird looks from the AM folks. And we go into the parking lot, and I was very proud of my brand new 1980 Toyota Corolla hatchback, 2-door with the lift back. And so I opened the passenger door for him, and Ozzy proceeds to climb into the back seat. And I'm thinking, what the hell is he doing? I've got to slide the seat forward. There's absolutely no leg room back there. I go, Ozzy, you can sit up front with me. It's cool. You'll be more comfortable here. He's, no, I always sit in the back seat. So anyhow, I'm driving down Franklin Street, and in my rearview mirror, there's Ozzy sitting in my back seat. I'm like, he thinks he's in a limo. Only the limo has shrunk. But it was just priceless. I'll never forget that.
Sharon!
Where's this car I'm driving in? Guys, let's go back to the beginning here. The moment you two were bitten by the radio bug. How did it happen, and where did it happen?
I got the radio bug when I was, 12, 13 years old. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I didn't come to New Jersey until I was in my teens. My dad moved us, because of a job. And that summer before we moved, I was grounded because I, got all Fs or something. I can't even remember what it was on a report card. But, I would be listening to the radio because it's the only thing I was allowed to do. And, I'm listening to 13Q in Pittsburgh, big top 40 radio station.
5 o'clock at WKTQ Pittsburgh. We're 13Q and we are your station. Hey, this is the Wolf, baby. John King Company.
I just started falling in love with, the way that all of that was, going on and those jocks. And I eventually got into radio and, did all the stops that I did. And then I got into doing the journalism end of it, and the promotion end of it at, FMQB and the other trade magazines. My two idols, the dichotomy is 50 miles wide between the two of them. George Michael.
77 WABC. 7:32 Friday evening in New York. I'm George Michael with the best music on WABC.
And Dennis Elsas.
That's Blondie and A Heart of Glass. Mucho Mistrust. David Bowie before that, and The Golden Years. Here at 102.7. This is Dennis Elsas at WNAW-FM.
I got to interview, both of those guys, and I got to have a friendship with Scott Shannon.
My name is Scott Shannon. And I'm Ross Britton. We are radio announcers every morning on the Z100 Morning Zoo, a serious radio show.
I would talk to him, occasionally about news stories and things like that. So, those were, kind of the real cool things that happened for me. Early on when I came to Jersey, I'd never heard anything or anybody like Dan Ingram before. I was like, oh my God, this guy is incredible.
Well, I will, depending on the negotiations. Bob Seger, number 12 on WABC at 13 minutes past 4 o'clock on the Dan Ingram Show. Oh, I don't love you anymore. Well, turn red by a toe to
And then you would listen to, like Pat St. John on WPLJ and Carol Miller and Jim Kerr, Scott Scottso on WNEW.
Scott Muni at WNEW-FM in New York. Most enjoyably mild is the weather picture right through tomorrow. With sunshine around this afternoon.
Those people and those radio stations, just kept that fire, inside of me. And I graduated from high school, and that summer I went right away to Brookdale Community College, which is in Lincroft, New Jersey. And the reason I did is because they had a radio program and they had a radio station, WBJB 90.5. So I immediately, that summer after high school graduation, started working on WBJB, doing the news. You were talking earlier about that very first time you ever went on the air. OMG. You're in this little tiny booth, off the main studio, and, the doors closed and there's a microphone and you hear the sounder going off and the words. The words are not coming. It was one of those kind of disasters. But, we got through that, ended up doing music shows, on the station. And I mentioned that I lived in Howell, New Jersey. There was a station less than a mile from my house that was licensed to Lakewood, New Jersey. WHLW was a daytime station at 1170 at the time. And I started hanging out there. And the reason that I was hanging out there was because there were a couple of jocks who I listened to in Pittsburgh, like Joey Reynolds and Marcia Nicely. I started going down to the radio station and knocked on the door one day and said, "Hey, I love radio. Can I empty your garbage?" And you've heard those stories, and that's exactly to a T how it happened for me. And that's ended up being my very first professional radio job.
I'm Mike Boyle, reminding you to join Eric Johnson, our morning guy. Brick Wheels 81 happens tomorrow morning at the Center.
And your radio career kept you around the Jersey Shore for a bit in those days. In fact, when you eventually began working at WMGM in Atlantic City, you were also commuting to Philly for a weekend gig at YSP, right?
My good friend Mark Didia, who actually is responsible for me coming to WMGM.
The King of Dirt, right?
The King of Dirt, yeah. We have Dr. Dirt and the King of Dirt. And Mark Didia also worked at FMQB. I replaced him. But, Mark is responsible for getting me into YSP, at that time.
94 YSP, Philly's best rock and roll. Everywhere he goes, the kids want to rock. That's Brian Adams from the new one, Reckless. And this is Mike Boyle. 94 YSP is Philly's concert information station with up-to-minute details on the Live Aid concert that's coming up to JFK on July 13th. Speaking of Brian Adams.
It was different. It was about, an hour and a half drive from where I live in New Jersey into Philadelphia. But you didn't think about it in those terms. You just like, oh my gosh, I get to do this. Work on the same radio station as people like Steve Ski, Pam Murley, Anita Gevinson. And the list goes on and on and on, and every time you walk in that building, you're pinching yourself going, I'm really doing this?
All over Philly, people are saying, rock on with 94 YSP. All right, let's try them. Rock on, Philly.
I'm Robin Zander. I'm Rick Nielsen of Cheap Trick. Rock on, Philly.
Hi, this is George Thurger for WYSP. Rock on, Philly.
Hey, Sammy Hagar here. Rock on, Philly.
Rock on, Philly. 94 YSP.
I would go to staff meetings. I would make the drive during the week. And you'd be sitting in this room with these people and you're looking around going, oh my God, this has got to be a dream.
Paul, you grew up in Buffalo. Talk about those stations in upstate New York at that time. What inspired you?
I grew up in Buffalo in the 1960s and the 1970s. So, we had one of the greatest AM top 40 radio stations in the country, WKBW, 1520 AM, 50,000 watt clear channel station that at night would cover the entire Atlantic seaboard. And it had just had legendary personalities like Joey Reynolds and Danny Neverett.
Here is music with Dan Neverett. Neverett on KB Radio. Neverett stops in Buffalo. After school or driving home on Radio 1520. It's the Dan Neverett.
And Bud Ballou and Jackson Armstrong. And so when I was in high school, we had a program at St. Joe's where I went called Career Week. You got to pick a career and spend a week on the job at a place of business in that career. So I picked radio, and I got to spend a week at WKBW. This was 1971. The station was still massively successful because the audience migration from AM to FM happened more slowly in Buffalo than in other cities, in large part due to the strength of KB. The program director was Jefferson Kay, who later became the voice of NFL films.
Jefferson Kay is program director of the 50,000-watt giant, WKBW, Buffalo, New York.
KB is a contemporary, highly individual, personality-oriented, and hopefully entertaining radio station. Since the turn to top 40, music and news, rock and roll, whatever you choose to call it, some 15 years ago, KB has led the market with a policy of personality radio. We've tried to adhere to a certain kind of predictable unpredictability.
I remember sitting in his office. There were 3 or 4 of us that picked radio from St. Joe's. And he's telling us why we don't want to work in radio. And he explains, look, radio's like a pyramid. There's thousands of people at the bottom of the pyramid making hardly any money. And then there's a handful at the top that are making, guerrilla dollars.
A pyramid scheme, yeah.
Yeah, right, pretty much. And I thought, oh, okay. I think I asked him, so if radio sucks so bad, why are you working in it? Anyhow, maybe that was an indicator that I would be good at interviewing people down the road. But anyhow, we got to spend a week on the job. My favorite moment was sitting in on a music meeting with Don Burns, who was the music director at the time. He later went on to work at CFNY in Toronto, a big progressive and then alternative station. But in any event, this was back in the day when Buffalo still had their own local reps. There were like a dozen of them. One day a week, they would come into Don's office all together with their 45 RPM vinyl records and pitch them on their new stuff. So he'd be like, Mike Boyle, what do you got? And Mike's, here, I've got the latest from, Joe Schmo and the whatever. Don would put the 45 on the turntable. He'd listen to about 30 seconds. If he liked it, he kept the 45, put it on a little stack on his desk. If he didn't like it, he'd pitch it back to him like a Frisbee through the air and say, what else you got? And so they went through this whole round like that. It was really incredible. And I thought, wow, this is how it works. And the philosophy was that if it didn't grab you in 30 seconds, or if it didn't grab him in 30 seconds, it wasn't going to grab the audience. Right. That was my inspiration. I did not know what I wanted to do prior to that week. After that week, there was no question in my mind that radio was what I wanted to do. So I enrolled at the State University of New York College at Brockport. They had a college station, WBSU, an AM carrier current station.
The blues have been around as long as time itself. Well, where have you been? Don't worry, though, wherever you're at, just make sure there's a radio nearby, Sunday night from 6 to 8 p.m., because that's when WBSU plays 2 hours of the finest blues and R&B ever recorded. You'll get over 60 years worth of music.
When I went to apply for a shift, they said, there's a waiting list to get on the air. You got to engineer somebody else's show for a semester. So I did that, and then I got my 1 hour a week. And I came across a tape from WBSU, me on WBSU as a jock within the last few years. And I was just horrible. You can't imagine how bad I sounded. I sounded like a bad classical music announcer on Quaaludes. It was just abysmal.
How do you go from WBSU to the legendary WCMF?
WCMF presents Rocktober. This fall, WCMF will fly 70 people to New York City for the Stones.
Yeah, so CMF, I interned at the station while I was in college, and my job was to compile the weekly record sales survey. So I'd call all the record stores. I was always interested to see what was outselling that week, Kiss Alive or Kiss Destroyer, because Kiss had like 2 hits at the same time. But after graduation, I bugged the crap out of the program director, Bernie Kimball, and he finally gave me a gig. Great guy. I had moved to Rochester to work 6 hours a week at CMF, which included an hour and a half of me on the air, and the rest was like the God Squad tapes and engineering a live Spanish language music show. But it was an incredible experience because CMF in 1977 was still freeform. It was one of the last FM rock stations that had not adopted a format. And there were thousands of records in the air studio, and then in the basement vaults, there were like 10,000 more albums. Not that we didn't play the popular stuff. I mean, there was a hot box of current albums at the time, Bob Seger, Live Bullet, Alan Parsons Project, iRobot. You remember that era, a couple Boston albums. So yeah, I worked there for a year and a half and eventually became like the swing shift guy that got to fill in when a full-timer was on vacation. So CMF was an incredible radio station. It was locally owned, jocks that were from Rochester, owners that lived in Rochester, a very dedicated programmer, Bernie Kimball, who actually built a studio in the garage. So when bands came in, they could play live on the air. It was just an amazing experience.
And your last radio gig was at 97 Rock, Buffalo's top rock station from like 1980 to 1985. Talk about that experience.
Yeah, so George Harris, the PD, had come in from WZZO in Allentown, and WGRQ at the time was known as QFM 97, and it was sort of this post-hippie flower power AOR station that really hadn't evolved to the way it needed to.
Did you know that QFM 97 plays music by everybody's favorites, like Billy Joel, Fleetwood Mac, Chuck Mangione, and the Rolling Stones? Did you also know that
So George basically blew it up, hired all new air staff, relaunched the station as 97 Rock with that classic graffiti logo, white letters on black background. It became, like the black t-shirt, down and dirty, rude rock station that was like perfect for blue collar Buffalo. WGRN Buffalo, 97 Rock. And the ratings took off like a rocket under George's direction. And it was an incredible air staff. Over the years, I got to work with the Bearman, Larry Norton, Bruce Barber, J.C. Corcoran. And that was wow. Those were just the morning talents that were there over the years. Lori Githens, Mark Henning, Cindy Chan, Bill Weston, John Hager, Carl Russo, Tom Tiberi. It was an incredible time.
You heard the Stones on 97 Rock. Billy Squier's obviously a big fan of that band. There's a track on his new album, sounds just like the Stones. I'll let you check it out firsthand in just a couple moments when we use it to start a 45-minute music marathon. I'm Paul Heine. If you're a victim of Olympic fever, then you got to check out the Olympics, Fun or Games. It's our exclusive behind.
We were all in our 20s. We were kind of learning the business, and we were just having fun.
Then the big transition point for you and your family. You had to make the difficult decision. You left the almighty 97 Rock in Buffalo.
I mean, I've got to give a lot of credit to my wife because I was talking about, well, we could move to Detroit or we could move to Worcester or we could move to Charleston, West Virginia. And she's like, I'm not going to Charleston, West Virginia. I mean, nothing against Charleston, but she was like, I need to be within a one-day drive of my mom, who was handicapped and in a wheelchair, and Paula was really looking after her. And so I realized that, I needed a job with more stability than radio could necessarily give. And so that made the FMQB opportunity a lot more attractive to both of us. Like I was saying, 19 years there, it was the right move.
But before you left Buffalo, Paul, you had some interesting encounters with rock stars there. Talk about your studio experience with Frank Zappa.
It was in the early 80s at 97 Rock. And Frank was a very outspoken person against the PMRC, the Parents Music Resource Center. He saw it as akin to censorship. So we talked a lot about that, and TV crews came down from the local TV stations because Frank was big news then. And I remember he came in, it's like Frank Zappa with the beard and hair and this massive bodyguard and, somewhat intimidating, but really cool to speak with. We talked about music censorship. We talked about how he had been coming into Buffalo quietly to work with the Buffalo Philharmonic Orchestra. Back then in radio, you would always try to get the the guests to do something like to read a liner or do the weather. I got them to read the news.
What's the name of this station?
97 Rock.
That's what I thought. This is Frank Zappa with the news. Listen, former state Republican Party Chairman Richard Rosenbaum says that although he has raised a substantial sum of money for a possible gubernatorial campaign, he won't decide if he'll run until next year. What do you think of that? The Rochester attorney says...
There's Frank Zappa reading the most boring news off the New York State Newswire. You know, what's going on in Utica, Rome, New York. And he's like, really? This is news?
Do you realize what we've just been listening to here? Non-news for about 3 or 4 minutes. This is all that's happening in Buffalo?
They're paying people large salaries to write this stuff.
And they keep putting N's in there, in the primary.
We're talking with Frank Zappa at 97 Rock.
Zappa was a real treat.
You guys talk about the cross-pollination at FMQB. I too remember that being a time in radio when you could easily jump from one thing to another, whether it be radio to records, radio to the trades, or even radio to radio station in the same market. Not so much anymore, right? In fact, a lot of people find themselves on the beach more often than not, trying to take this unique skill set that was invested into one industry and then applying it to something else, being forced to apply it to something else. Now, you guys kind of had a head start doing this, and I'm curious, from your experience of being able to pivot, what advice would you give our contemporaries in the business right now? And how should they approach and look at this from a more positive rather than detrimental lens?
My first bit of advice would be to trust your gut. As obvious as that might sound, it really, really resonated with me on many occasions when I decided to leave radio and then when I decided to leave the trade magazine business. Because by that time I had worked, for FMQB as an editor, College Radio Trade Magazine, CMJ. I was the editor there for a couple of years. Did my time at Billboard Radio Monitor and then R&R. And when R&R went away in 2009, I just kind of looked around and went, your gut's talking to you again, Mike. Maybe it's just time to leave this business. And the biggest thing that I had going for me was that I had developed over my time in radio and my time in journalism, Radio Trade Magazine, journalism, I developed a whole bunch of skills that I was able to take into the marketing world. So when R&R went away in 2009, I was, unemployed for, a few weeks, but I managed to hook up with a company local to us who needed somebody to look after their websites and content and help with the marketing. And so that's what I had been doing from 2009 until just recently when I semi-retired. And I'm continuing in my retirement to do some consulting marketing. But trust your gut, I was able to take my writing skills, my web skills, which I developed early on from putting on, FMQB's very first website, being a part of that team. Heck, I was even able to take my radio experience and start a podcast.
This is Salesforce Simplified, the podcast from Ad Victoriam Solutions. Here's your host, Mike Boyle.
So nice to have you all join us again here on the Ad Victoriam Salesforce. And I did a podcast for the last company that I worked at. We did, nearly 100 episodes. The company I worked for was a technology company based in Atlanta, and they were a Salesforce consulting company. Just trust your gut. You've got it inside of you to reinvent yourself. Just step back and think about it.
Yeah, I would echo what Mike's saying. Take some time to think about what it is you want to do and what you're good at. And if you pull back a little bit, you'll see that you've developed a lot of skills in radio that you can apply in other industries, whether it's managing people, whether it's event marketing and promotion, whether it's production, technology, or content creation. I mean, at heart, if you're on the air, you're a content creator. There's lots of opportunities to develop content beyond just broadcast radio. Podcasting is one, but if you use your imagination, there's so many other ways that you can develop content. So I would say, don't sell yourself short, and think big and network like hell. Call everybody you know. Let them know what you're looking for. Brainstorm with them. Find people that have made the transition to another industry and pick their brain. It's just a great opportunity. Like we were talking earlier, one door closes, another opens. Sounds like a cliche, but really that's kind of how it works.
Mike and Paul, thank you so much for being on this Air Check session. It's important to tell the story of radio from all sides of the business, isn't it? And when those tales are spoken by the storytellers themselves, it brings it all together. Even better is to be able to tell some of those shared stories together. And like Steve and I, you two have remained friends through the entire journey, which I think is awesome. In fact, all four of us have watched our respective careers go where they went. We're a tight group in the radio family, and I think I speak for Steve when I say that we're both very proud to have been part of this radio life.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun, and Rich, I just would, echo the respect. It's great that we've been able to be friends, the four of us, for as many years as we have, and we have a lot to commiserate on. We have a lot we each understand about things that we've all gone through.
This box of 4 for me, priceless.
I agree.
Yeah, much respect to Rich and to Steve, because we've heard you on the radio on countless stations in Atlantic City and Philly and around the dial. It's great to sit down and talk shop with you guys and share stories. And Mike and I will be figuring out our next breakfast where he can show me his latest gadget and bring me up to speed on his new gig. So this was really a lot of fun.
We literally only live 3 miles from each other.
Thanks, guys.
You can follow us, stream, and download every episode of Air Check on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube.
Give us a great rating and share the show with a friend. We've uncovered some great radio stories with each and every episode.
This is Rich DeSisto.
And I'm Steve Raymond.
We'll talk to you soon.
Closing out another episode of Air Check, a podcast about radio's personality from radio personalities. If you have radio stories to share, we'd love to hear from you. Join the Air Check guest list. Email aircheckme@gmail.com. Musical props are Chris Gordon's. Announcer props, I'll take those. Greg O'Brien, the OB. Air Check is the creation of RDPK Productions.